Winter fieldwork in northern Minnesota is mostly about preparation. If you spend enough time studying wildlife in that part of the country, you learn that the biggest threat usually isn't animals or getting lost. It's the weather. The temperature can drop quickly, storms can roll in faster than forecast models suggest, and visibility can disappear in minutes if the wind decides to push snow across the forest. By the time this happened in February of 2021, I had already been working as a wildlife biologist for several years. My research focused on tracking wolf and moose movement patterns in the forests near Ely. A lot of the work involved hiking remote sections of land in winter, checking camera traps, and collecting data from tracking collars. You learn quickly how to move in that environment. Layer clothing correctly, carry more water than you think you'll need, always have spare batteries for your headlamp, and most importantly, always know where the nearest shelter is in case the weather turns. That last rule is why I knew about the Ranger cabin. It sat several miles off a snowmobile trail in a section of forest managed by the state. The structure itself was small, just a single-room wooden building used occasionally by park staff during long winter patrols. I had marked it on my map the first season I started working in the area, not because I expected to use it often, but because in deep winter, knowing where a solid roof exists can make a big difference if conditions change. That afternoon had started normally. The forecast called for light snow later in the evening, but nothing serious. I had planned a short hike out to check 2 remote trail cameras that monitored a game corridor running along a frozen creek. The snowpack was deep but stable, and the sky was gray in the way northern skies usually are in winter. Nothing about the morning suggested a storm was building. By early afternoon, I had already checked the first camera and was working my way toward the second when the wind started picking up. At first, it was just a steady push through the trees. Then the snowfall thickened. In less than half an hour, the visibility dropped from several hundred yards to maybe 50 feet. That kind of shift isn't uncommon in February, but it always forces a decision. Continue toward the next checkpoint or head back before conditions worsen. I chose to turn around. The second camera could wait. The problem was that by the time I started back toward the trail, the storm had intensified faster than I expected. The wind pushed snow across the forest floor, hard enough to erase older tracks. Even the darker tree trunks started blending into the gray air as the snowfall thickened. Walking in a blizzard isn't like walking through ordinary snowfall. Your world shrinks. You focus on the next few steps, the shape of the terrain directly ahead of you, the direction your compass tells you to keep moving. That's when I remembered the cabin. Based on my position, the Ranger cabin was closer than the trailhead. It wasn't originally part of my route that day, but it was within walking distance if I adjusted my direction slightly west. Reaching solid shelter in a storm like that made more sense than trying to push all the way back to the truck. So I changed course. The forest grew quieter the deeper I moved into it. The wind still roared overhead through the higher branches, but the thicker stands of pine blocked some of it at ground level. Snow collected along the sides of fallen logs and buried smaller brush until the forest floor looked smoother than it really was. By the time the cabin came into view, I could barely see more than 30 yards ahead. It appeared slowly through the storm, just a dark, rectangular shape between the trees. I felt immediate relief. Even a small building can feel like a fortress when the wind and snow are building around you. The door was unlocked, just like I remembered. Inside, the cabin was simple but functional. 1 wooden table, 2 chairs, a small cast iron stove in the corner, and a stack of firewood along the wall. Someone from the Park Service must have restocked it earlier in the season. I closed the door behind me and took a moment to let my eyes adjust. The sudden quiet inside the cabin felt strange after hours of wind. The walls creaked occasionally as gusts hit the structure, but otherwise, the room was still. I brushed the snow from my jacket and gloves, then moved to the stove. Getting a fire going was the first priority. It didn't take long. The wood was dry and the stovepipe drew smoke upward quickly once the first flames caught. Within 20 minutes, the room started warming enough that I could take off my outer layer. The storm outside continued to build. Snow struck the windows in waves whenever the wind gusted. The glass was old enough that it rattled slightly in the frame when the pressure changed. I checked my phone out of habit. No signal. That wasn't surprising. The entire region has spotty coverage even on clear days. I settled into one of the chairs near the stove and drank water while the fire grew stronger. My plan was simple: wait out the storm until morning. By then, the snow would likely stop, visibility would return, and I could hike back to the truck without rushing through a whiteout. I had food in my pack and enough supplies to stay comfortable overnight. It wasn't ideal, but it was manageable. An hour passed that way. The fire burned steadily. The wind outside came and went in long gusts. Occasionally, I stood and walked to the window to check how thick the snowfall had become. Each time, the view looked worse. The trees just beyond the cabin faded into pale shapes behind a curtain of blowing snow. It was during one of those moments at the window that I saw the light. At first, I thought it was a reflection. The fire behind me cast a faint glow across the glass, and for a second, I assumed that was all I was seeing. But when I shifted slightly, the glow remained. A small yellow light, somewhere out in the forest. I leaned closer to the window. Through the swirling snow, the light appeared and disappeared as gusts passed through the trees. It looked steady, not moving. Just a soft, warm glow at about the height you would expect from a cabin window. I stood there watching it for several minutes. The light stayed in roughly the same position relative to a cluster of trees I could barely see through the storm. That meant it probably wasn't a reflection from inside the cabin. It was coming from somewhere outside. My first thought was that it must be another ranger cabin, but I knew the maps for that section of forest well. The nearest building besides the one I was standing in should have been several miles away, certainly not close enough to see through heavy snowfall. Still, I couldn't dismiss the possibility entirely. The storm distorted distance and visibility in strange ways. A structure farther away might appear closer if the snow thinned for a moment between gusts. I stepped outside briefly to check. The cold hit hard immediately. Wind pushed snow across the clearing in fast-moving sheets. I could still see the light. Faint, yellow, steady. It seemed to sit deeper in the forest beyond the clearing, maybe 100 yards away, though it was difficult to judge. I considered walking toward it. Another building could mean another person sheltering from the storm. But the wind had grown stronger since I entered the cabin. The snow was deep enough now that each step sank halfway to my knee, and leaving the safety of the cabin during a whiteout could easily make a simple situation worse. So I stepped back inside and closed the door. For the next hour, I watched the light come and go through the blowing snow. Sometimes it disappeared entirely behind thick gusts, then it returned again in the same place, steady, unmoving. At one point, I thought I heard something outside, a dull thump against the cabin wall. But when I listened carefully, the only sound was wind pressing against the structure. Eventually, the storm grew heavy enough that the light vanished completely behind the snow. I assumed the visibility had simply dropped too low to see it anymore. Sometime later that night, exhaustion finally caught up with me. I added another log to the stove, rolled out my sleeping bag near the warm side of the room, and tried to rest. The storm continued all night. The wind rattled the windows occasionally, but the cabin held steady. When morning came, the forest outside looked completely different. The sky had cleared enough for sunlight to filter through the clouds, and fresh snow covered everything in smooth, bright drifts. I stepped outside and stretched, letting my eyes adjust to the open daylight. The storm had left nearly a foot of new snow across the clearing. Tree branches sagged under the weight. Everything looked clean and quiet. Then I remembered the light. I turned toward the direction where I had seen it the night before. In daylight, the forest extended normally in that direction. Pines, birch trees, a shallow rise in the terrain. No buildings, no clearing, nothing. I walked out past the edge of the cabin clearing to check more closely. Fresh snow covered the ground without any visible tracks. No paths, no signs of a structure, just undisturbed forest stretching away between the trees. I stood there for several minutes, scanning the area carefully. If there had been another cabin nearby, even hidden by trees, I should have been able to see part of the roof or chimney now that the storm had passed, but there was nothing there. Eventually, I returned to the cabin, packed my gear, and started the hike back toward the trail. The snow made the walk slow, but the clear sky helped with navigation. By mid-afternoon, I reached my truck. Later that week, when I reviewed my field maps again, I double-checked the building locations in that entire section of forest. The ranger cabin I had used was the only structure within several miles. No secondary shelters, no research stations, no private cabins listed in the survey data. Even now, the memory of that light stays with me, not because I can prove what it was, but because I know exactly where it appeared in the forest. And I know that when the storm cleared the next morning, there was nothing there. At the time this happened, I worked as a regional sales rep for a company that supplied agricultural equipment. My territory covered parts of Wyoming, South Dakota, and Nebraska, which meant I spent a lot of time driving highways that cut through open country where towns can be 40 or 50 miles apart. In winter, you learn to respect the weather out there. Storms move fast across the plains, and when they do, the road can go from clear to nearly invisible in a matter of minutes. I'd already had a few close calls over the years, so I kept an eye on forecasts and tried not to push my luck when conditions started turning. But sometimes the weather changes faster than the forecasts predict. That's what happened in December of 2022. I had spent the afternoon meeting with a dealership outside Rapid City and was heading south on a rural highway toward my next stop when the wind started picking up. At first, it just pushed snow across the road in thin sheets, nothing serious. Then the sky darkened. Within half an hour, the snowfall thickened enough that the lines on the pavement started disappearing between gusts. I slowed down immediately. Driving in a blizzard isn't about speed. It's about staying on the road long enough to find a safe place to wait it out. Unfortunately, the stretch of highway I was on didn't have many options. No towns nearby, no truck stops, just open land and occasional dirt roads branching off into farmland. Visibility dropped to maybe 30 feet in front of the headlights. The snow hit the windshield hard enough that the wipers struggled to keep up. After a few more miles, I realized the situation was getting worse instead of better. The road itself had begun disappearing under the snow. That's when I spotted the side road, a narrow gravel path cut away from the highway toward a cluster of dark shapes in the distance. It looked like it might lead to a farmhouse or some kind of property. I turned onto it carefully. The tires slipped slightly as they left the pavement, but the truck managed to grip the packed snow well enough to keep moving. A few hundred yards down the road, the outline of a farmhouse appeared through the blowing snow. It was an older place, 2 stories. Weathered wood siding, a long porch running across the front. At first glance, it looked abandoned. The windows were dark. Snow had piled up along the edges of the steps, but the structure itself seemed intact. And right then, that was all I needed. Staying in the truck overnight during a storm like that wasn't ideal. Inside a building, even an empty one, you at least had protection from the wind. I parked the truck near the front gate and walked toward the porch. The wind cut through my coat immediately. Snow swirled around the corners of the house in thick bursts. I climbed the steps and tried the front door. Locked. I knocked anyway, more out of habit than expectation. "Hello?" I called. No answer. The porch wrapped around the side of the house, so I walked along it, checking the other doors. The second door near the kitchen opened easily when I turned the handle. The interior was dark. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The silence was immediate. Storm noise dropped from a roar to a distant muffled sound outside the walls. I stood still for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. The room looked like a kitchen. Old cabinets, a narrow table, a sink beneath a window that was frosted along the edges. Dust covered most of the surfaces, the kind of dust that builds up when a house sits unused for a long time. That confirmed my first impression. The place probably hadn't been lived in for months. But when I stepped farther into the house, I noticed something that didn't match the rest of the room. Light flickered against the far wall. I followed it down a short hallway into the living room and stopped. A fire was burning in the fireplace. Not a dying fire either. Actual flames. Fresh wood. The kind of steady burn you get when someone has tended it recently. For several seconds, I just stared at it. An abandoned house shouldn't have an active fire. I called out toward the rest of the building. "Hello?" My voice echoed slightly through the hallway. No response. I walked through the first floor slowly, checking each room. Dining room, empty. Small office space, dust everywhere. Back hallway leading toward a staircase. No one. Every room looked unused except for the living room, where the fire burned steadily in the hearth. Eventually, I returned to the fireplace and crouched beside it. The wood inside was dry and freshly placed. Whoever started the fire hadn't done it hours ago. It had been done recently enough that the flames were still strong. I added a small piece of wood from the stack beside the fireplace just to keep it going. Then I sat down in one of the chairs facing the hearth. My first assumption was that someone else had taken shelter in the house earlier and stepped out for some reason. Maybe they had gone to check a vehicle or gather supplies from outside. The storm might have forced them to take cover the same way I had. So I waited. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. No one returned. Outside, the wind continued hammering against the house. Snow rattled against the windows like handfuls of gravel thrown against the glass. Eventually, I stood up again and walked back through the first floor just to make sure I hadn't missed anyone. Still nothing. But as I passed the staircase near the back hallway, I noticed something I hadn't before. Footprints in the dust, faint ones, leading toward the stairs. They weren't fresh enough to leave clean impressions, but they had disturbed the dust just enough that you could see where someone had walked. I followed them to the bottom step. They continued upward. I looked up the staircase. The second floor was dark. Only a faint glow from the fire behind me reached the first few steps. I considered going up right then. But something about the silence in the house made me hesitate. Instead, I went back to the living room and sat near the fire again. The warmth felt good after standing outside in the wind earlier. I told myself that if someone was upstairs, they would come down eventually once they realized another person was in the house. For a while, the only sound was the fire crackling in the hearth. Then I heard it. A slow step. Above me, the floorboards on the second floor creaked once, then again. The sound traveled across the ceiling toward the far side of the house. I sat up immediately. "Hello?" I called. The footsteps stopped. No answer came back. I waited. A few seconds passed, then another step. Whoever was upstairs had started walking again. This time the movement sounded slower, deliberate, like someone pacing across the room. I stood and walked toward the base of the staircase. The steps above me remained dark. "Hey," I called. "I took shelter from the storm. Didn't mean to scare you." The footsteps stopped again. I waited for a reply. None came. Instead, somewhere above me, a door closed. Not slammed, just a quiet click of wood against the frame. That was the moment the situation stopped feeling like simple shelter. If someone was upstairs, they had heard me, and they had chosen not to answer. The storm outside made leaving immediately difficult. The wind was strong enough that I could barely see beyond the porch earlier. Still, standing in the middle of an empty farmhouse while someone moved around on the second floor without speaking wasn't a situation I wanted to stay in any longer than necessary. I backed away from the staircase and returned to the living room. The fire continued burning steadily. For several minutes, I listened carefully. Nothing. Then another creak upstairs. Slow. Measured. Someone had started walking again. But this time the footsteps stopped directly above the living room, right over the spot where I stood. I looked up at the ceiling. The boards shifted slightly as weight moved across them. Whoever was up there was standing still now, listening. I waited a few seconds. Then I stepped back toward the front hallway and grabbed my coat. The storm outside was still heavy, but at least out there I understood the danger. Inside the house, I had no idea who was moving above me, or why they had started the fire in the first place. I opened the door carefully and stepped back onto the porch. The wind hit me immediately. Snow blasted across the yard in thick sheets. I hurried to the truck and climbed inside. The engine started after a couple tries. I turned the heater on and sat there watching the house through the windshield. For a moment, nothing moved. Then one of the upstairs windows shifted slightly, just enough that the curtain inside moved. Someone was looking down at the truck from the second floor. I couldn't see their face through the blowing snow, but I knew they were there, and they had never answered when I called out. Responding to crashes in a blizzard changes the normal rhythm of ambulance work. On a clear day, a vehicle in the ditch is usually simple to read from a distance. You see the angle of the car, whether airbags went off, whether someone's standing outside waving you down, whether law enforcement has already arrived. Even before you step out, the scene starts explaining itself. In a blizzard, almost none of that is true. The storm narrows everything. Headlights only show a little at a time, sound gets swallowed, tracks disappear while you're still looking at them. And the person you're trying to help can be 10 feet away and still feel outside the scene until they move into the light. That's what made this call stick with me. I was 33 at the time, working as a paramedic outside Green Bay in February of 2023. Winter calls are normal in Wisconsin. You get used to spinouts, minor pileups, cars sliding into ditches because somebody thought four-wheel drive meant the laws of physics didn't apply to them anymore. But there's a difference between responding in bad weather and responding in a real whiteout. That night had crossed into whiteout. The shift had already been busy before we got the call. Me and my partner Dan had handled 2 weather-related incidents in less than 3 hours. One was a pickup that slid through an intersection and clipped a guardrail. The other was an older man who tried walking from his stranded vehicle to a farmhouse he thought was closer than it was. By the time dispatch toned us out again, both of us were already running on that narrow focus you get when the weather is causing enough problems that you stop thinking beyond the next address. The call came in just after 1 a.m. Single vehicle in the ditch on a county road outside Green Bay. Caller was another motorist who reported seeing the rear of a car angled down in the snow near a drainage slope. They had not stopped because the weather was too bad to safely pull over, but they said the driver's side door looked open. Open door in a blizzard changes things immediately. A lot of crash calls are about injury inside the vehicle. An open door means the person may already be outside, and in that weather, exposure becomes part of the emergency almost as fast as trauma. Dan was driving. I sat up front working the MDT and radio while snow hammered the windshield hard enough that the wipers sounded strained even on their highest setting. Visibility was bad enough that every reflective sign looked too close when it first appeared. The county road narrowed after we turned off the main route, and that made everything feel more exposed. Less traffic, no shoulder worth mentioning. Ditches on both sides and fields disappearing into white on either side of the road. There were a few mailboxes and the occasional shape of a tree line, but for long stretches it felt like we were driving through nothing except our own headlights. Dispatch updated us once and said law enforcement was also en route, but they were coming from farther out. That meant we would likely be first on scene. I remember checking our extrication bag and cold weather blankets even though I already knew where everything was. It was just something to do with my hands while the road disappeared and reappeared in front of us. We found the car because Dan caught the reflector on the rear bumper before I did. It was a dark sedan, nose down in the ditch on the right side of the road, angled sharply enough that the rear wheels were still partly visible from the pavement. Snow had already built up along the lower half of the doors. The hazard lights were off. The headlights were still on, but one beam was pointed into the snowbank at a strange angle, throwing diffuse light instead of a clean cone, and the driver's door was open. Dan positioned the ambulance ahead of the car so our scene lights would cover as much of the ditch line as possible without blinding traffic. There wasn't much traffic to worry about, but habit is habit. He radioed our location. I pulled on my outer gloves, grabbed the jump bag, and stepped down into wind that hit hard enough to make me lower my head immediately. Cold like that feels sharp right away. Not the gradual kind. The kind that goes through a weak spot in your clothing the second you step into it. The snow was blowing sideways across the ditch, and every movement outside the ambulance happened inside a tunnel of light from the rig. Beyond that, it was just shifting white and dark. I moved toward the car first, while Dan stayed a step behind with the stretcher plan already in mind if we found someone inside. The driver's door was fully open, not just cracked. Snow had blown into the footwell and across the seat. That mattered, because it told me the car hadn't just gone off the road seconds before we got there. The opening had been exposed long enough for weather to start filling it. "Driver!" I shouted over the wind. "EMS!" No answer. I leaned in and swept my flashlight across the interior. Front seat empty. Passenger seat empty. No one in the back. The airbag on the driver's side had deployed and hung partially deflated over the wheel. There was blood on it, not a huge amount, but enough to confirm there had been at least some injury. The keys were still in the ignition. The engine was off. A purse sat on the passenger floorboard, half tipped over. I looked at Dan and said, "No one inside." That changed our priorities instantly. A missing driver in a blizzard is not just search the area, it's assess the crash, estimate how recently they left, determine whether they walked off injured, and figure out how far they could realistically have gone before cold and disorientation started working against them. I looked down into the snow near the open door. There were footprints, but the storm had already started erasing them. That's one of the hardest things about snowstorm scenes. You get traces, yet not evidence. A heel impression here, a drag there, then nothing, because the next gust fills the outline and levels it out. The tracks led away from the car toward the road for a few steps, then angled toward the rear of the ambulance. At least, that's what they seemed to do. I followed them with the flashlight, but by 6 or 8 feet out, they were no longer clear enough to read with confidence. Dan moved to the trunk side of the sedan and looked down the ditch line. "You see anything?" "Not yet," I said. I keyed the radio and told dispatch the vehicle was unoccupied, likely one patient on foot in severe weather, active search beginning. They acknowledged and said law enforcement was still several minutes out. That's when I noticed the movement. At first, it was just a dark shape in the snow beyond the rear corner of the ambulance, far enough out that the blowing white kept interrupting it, not moving fast, not waving, just present and then absent depending on how thick the gusts were between us. I turned my light toward it. A person, walking toward the ambulance, slowly, not stumbling exactly, but not moving with urgency either. "Dan," I said. He turned and followed my light. For a second, we both just watched. The figure stayed in the beam only in fragments. A coat, legs, the front of a body appearing and disappearing as the snow crossed in sheets between us. Too far to make out a face clearly. I shouted, "EMS, can you hear me?" No visible reaction. The person kept walking. In a normal crash scene, somebody who sees an ambulance usually waves, speeds up, or at least shows some sign that they understand help has arrived. This person did none of that. They just continued at the same slow pace. I grabbed the thermal blanket from the bag and started toward them, but only a few steps. I wasn't going to commit too far away from the ambulance in that visibility, not without knowing whether the person was hurt, intoxicated, or even the driver. As they got closer, more details came together. Female, mid-30s maybe. No hat, hair blown across her face and stiff with snow. No gloves that I could see. And the thing that hit me hardest was that she didn't seem to be shivering. People in deep cold after a crash are usually either visibly panicked, in pain, or moving in that stiff, urgent way that says their body is trying to stay warm. She just walked, not relaxed, but detached. I called again, louder, "Ma'am, stop right there." She stopped about 15 feet away. The storm pushed snow around her legs and threw the lights so hard that the edges of her looked blurred. "Are you the driver?" I asked. A pause. Then she nodded once. "Are you hurt?" Another pause. Then she said, "I couldn't stay in the car." Her voice sounded flat and rough, like it had been scraped by cold air. I moved another step closer, enough to check for obvious bleeding. There was blood on the side of her forehead running down into one eyebrow, but not pouring. More concerning was how underdressed she seemed for the conditions. Light jacket, jeans, no proper winter boots, one sleeve wet through at the cuff. "Come to the ambulance," I said. "Now." She looked past me toward the vehicle in the ditch instead of answering. That made me turn and look too, instinctively checking whether someone else had moved near the car. Nothing there. When I looked back at her, she had taken another step forward. Then she said something that made the scene tilt. I wasn't alone. I said, "Okay, where's the other person?" She looked over her shoulder into the white behind her, not toward the car. I thought he was behind me. Those words by themselves were not unusual. Crash victims say disjointed things all the time. Concussions, shock, adrenaline, cold. They all mess with sequence and certainty. Still, the way she said it didn't sound like confusion about a passenger climbing out after the crash. It sounded like she had been walking away from something. Dan had come up on my left at that point, staying close enough for us both to manage her if she dropped or became combative. He said, "Let's get you warm first. We'll sort the rest in the truck." She didn't resist, but she also didn't move toward the ambulance until I physically guided her by the elbow. The second I touched her sleeve, I realized how cold she already was. Not cool, not chilled. The fabric and the arm under it felt like something left too long outside. We got her into the back of the ambulance and sat her on the bench seat. The heater was blasting, and the warm air inside made my face sting after the wind. I started the usual rapid assessment while Dan updated dispatch and requested law enforcement expedite. Her pulse was fast, skin cold, pupils reactive, forehead laceration not severe, no obvious deformity in the limbs. She answered questions slowly but correctly enough at first. Name, age. Yes, she'd been driving. No, she wasn't sure how long she'd been walking. Then I asked who else had been in the car. She looked at me for a long second and said, "No one." I thought I had misheard her. "You just said you weren't alone." She blinked, then looked toward the rear doors of the ambulance. "I thought he was behind me," she said again. "Who?" She didn't answer. Outside, the wind rocked the ambulance slightly. Snow hissed across the rear windows. Dan stepped back into the patient compartment and said, "County's almost here." I asked him quietly, "Any sign of another patient?" He shook his head. "Nothing near the car." I circled the ambulance too. The woman kept looking at the rear doors. Not frantically, just steadily. I followed her line of sight once, and for a second, I thought I saw a shadow pass the frosted glass on the upper corner of the window. I stood immediately and moved to the door. By the time I opened it, there was nothing there except snow swirling in the work lights. That could have been weather. Headlight shift. My own reflection. I know that. But once the possibility enters the scene, it changes how every sound feels. I stepped down and checked the area around the ambulance again. The ditch, the shoulder, the side panel, the rear bumper. No person standing in the snow, no fresh movement I could trust enough to call real. Then law enforcement arrived and the whole scene widened. Once there are more units, more lights, more people, things get easier mechanically. Better scene control, better search pattern, more eyes, but that doesn't always make them make more sense. The deputy took over the roadway side, while Dan stayed with the patient and I walked the deputy through the car. Open driver's door, deployed airbag, blood, hearse. No obvious passenger sign from the first glance. We checked the interior more carefully then and found something that should have been obvious earlier but hadn't been, because the snow and the angle distorted everything. There was a second set of prints inside the car, not a full passenger presence, more like muddy transfer and a partial hand mark on the inside of the rear door behind the driver. Hard to read, not enough to prove much, but enough that the deputy agreed the possibility of another person was real. We searched as far out from the scene as the weather would allow without creating another rescue problem. Nothing. No body. No second victim. No clean footprints leading away. Just drifts and partially erased impressions that might have been made by the driver before we arrived or by someone else entirely. Back in the ambulance, the woman's story kept shifting around the edges. Sometimes she said she was alone. Sometimes she said she remembered someone standing in the road before the car went off. Then later, she said there had been someone in the back seat, but she couldn't describe him. At one point, she asked me whether we had let him in, and when I asked who she meant, she just stared at me like I'd missed something obvious. By the time we reached the hospital, her core temp had dropped enough that cold and shock were probably doing as much to her memory as the crash. Maybe all of it. I'm willing to accept that. But what stayed with me wasn't only what she said. It was the image of her coming out of the storm toward the ambulance at that slow pace, with the driver's door still open behind her and no one else visible anywhere around the car. And then that brief moment at the rear doors, when I thought something else had crossed the frosted glass and stepped back into the white before I reached it. I still respond to winter crashes. I still know how weather distorts scenes and people and judgment, but whenever I see an open door on a vehicle in deep snow now, I pay closer attention to the space just beyond the headlights than I used to. Because once someone walks away from the car into a blizzard, the storm stops being background and starts deciding what you're allowed to know. I grew up around snowmobiles. When you live in northern Minnesota, they're not a hobby. They're transportation half the winter. People use them to reach cabins, check traps, haul supplies, even get to neighbors when the roads close. Because of that, there's a basic rule everyone knows. You never leave one running unattended, especially not in a storm. That's why what I saw that night stuck with me, and why it still bothers me years later. This happened in January of 2021, outside Ely, Minnesota. I was 29 at the time, working for a small electrical contractor. That day, we'd been running lines to a remote cabin property about 30 minutes outside town. The weather report said a storm was moving in overnight, but up there forecasts change all the time, so nobody thought much of it. By the time we packed up around 4:30 p.m., the sky had already gone that dull gray color that usually means snow is on the way. I was driving my pickup alone down a narrow forest road that connected back to the highway. About 10 minutes into the drive, the snow started. At first, it was light, just flakes drifting through the headlights, but within another 10 minutes, it thickened fast. The kind of snow where your headlights turn the air into a white wall. I slowed to maybe 20 miles an hour. That road is already narrow, with trees pressing close on both sides. When the wind picks up, snow piles across it quickly. I remember thinking I should probably hurry, not because I was scared, just because storms up there can turn roads bad in a hurry. About another mile down the road, I saw something ahead in the beam of my headlights, a small red light. At first, I thought it was a reflector on a trail marker, but as I got closer, I realized what it was: a snowmobile. It was sitting just off the side of the road, partially buried in fresh snow. The red taillight was still glowing. The engine was still running. That was the first thing that felt wrong. Nobody leaves a snowmobile idling during a storm. Fuel is too precious, and machines can ice up if left sitting too long. I slowed my truck and rolled past it slowly. There were no tracks leading away, just the snowmobile, half dusted over already. I pulled about 20 yards ahead and stopped. At first, I just sat there, listening to the wind and the faint whine of the snowmobile engine behind me. My first thought was simple. Maybe someone had gone into the woods to check something. Up there, snowmobilers often stop to cut across trails or check trap lines. Still, something about the scene didn't feel right. The snow was coming down harder now, thick enough that if someone had walked away recently, I should have seen footprints. But the snowmobile trail leading in was already fading under the fresh snowfall. I grabbed my flashlight from the center console and stepped out of the truck. The cold hit immediately, sharp and dry. The wind was pushing snow sideways across the road. I walked back toward the snowmobile. It was a newer Polaris model, blue and black, still vibrating slightly from the running engine. Snow had started collecting on the seat and windshield. I shined my light around the area. No helmet, no rider, no footprints, nothing. Just untouched snow beyond the sled. That's when the second strange detail hit me. The throttle was slightly engaged, like someone had left it idling higher than normal. The machine sounded tense, almost impatient. I called out once, "Hello?" The sound disappeared into the trees. No response. I walked a few steps toward the forest edge. My boots sank into fresh powder, but even with the snowfall, I should have seen some sign of someone stepping off the trail. There was nothing. The snow beyond the road looked untouched. I turned back toward the snowmobile again, and that's when I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The handlebars were turned slightly, facing the road, not the direction the trail had come from, like the machine had been repositioned before stopping. I stood there for a moment, thinking through possibilities. Maybe someone had gotten injured. Maybe they'd gone into the woods and collapsed somewhere. The responsible thing would have been to search, but there were two problems. The storm was getting worse, and visibility was dropping fast. Up north, people learn quickly that wandering into the woods during a blizzard can turn dangerous very quickly, even for experienced outdoorsmen. I looked around one more time. Still no footprints, no movement in the trees, just the wind. Finally, I decided the best thing to do was report it. I reached into the sled's compartment and turned the engine off. The sudden silence felt heavier than the noise had. Then I drove another mile until I had cell signal and called the county sheriff's office. They told me to stay nearby if it was safe and a patrol would come check it out. It took about 20 minutes for a deputy to arrive. By then, the road looked completely different. Snow had already begun covering the snowmobile tracks. The deputy stepped out, looked at the sled, and asked the same question I'd been asking myself. "Where's the rider?" We walked the area again with stronger flashlights. Still nothing. No footprints, no disturbance in the snow, just trees and drifting flakes. The deputy eventually ran the registration on the sled. It came back belonging to a guy from a nearby town about 15 miles away. But here's the part that stuck with me. The sheriff's office contacted him, and he answered immediately. He told them his snowmobile was in his garage, exactly where he'd left it. They asked him to check. He went outside while still on the phone and confirmed it was still there, parked, covered in snow from the previous day. The deputy and I looked at each other when dispatch relayed that, because the sled in front of us was still sitting there on the roadside, exactly where I'd found it. Engine warm, tail light glowing faintly through the snowfall. Same registration, same machine. They eventually had it towed back to town. And I went home thinking maybe there was some kind of paperwork error, or maybe the owner had been confused. But the next morning, the story got stranger, because the man whose sled it supposedly was sent photos to the sheriff. Clear ones, showing his snowmobile, still in his garage, same color, same model, same registration numbers. To this day, I don't know how that was possible. The deputy later told me the sled we found was eventually listed as unclaimed property. No rider was ever reported missing. No accident reports, nothing. But the thing that still stays with me isn't the paperwork confusion. It's the moment I stood there beside that machine in the storm, listening to the engine running, knowing someone had been there just moments before, and yet somehow there were no tracks leading away. I've spent enough winters working in northern Minnesota to understand how quiet the woods can get once the snow starts falling. People imagine storms as loud, wind screaming through trees, branches snapping, snow blasting sideways like sand. But the scariest storms aren't like that. The scariest ones are the quiet ones, the kind where the snow just keeps falling, hour after hour, soft and steady, until the world feels like it's being slowly erased. This happened in February of 2022, about 40 miles outside Duluth. I was 31 at the time, working seasonal maintenance for a group of rental cabins scattered along a frozen lake. During the winter, most of them sit empty, except for the occasional snowmobiler or ice fisherman passing through. Part of my job was simple: drive out every couple days, check propane levels, clear drifts from doors, make sure pipes hadn't frozen, routine stuff. That afternoon, the forecast mentioned a storm rolling in overnight, so I decided to swing by the cabins one last time before the roads got bad. There were 5 cabins total, spaced out along the edge of the lake. By the time I turned off the main road onto the narrow service trail, the sky had already gone that flat gray color. That means snow is coming soon. I didn't think much of it. I'd driven that route dozens of times. The truck crawled along the packed snow trail, tires crunching slowly through the thin crust of ice that had formed during the day. The woods were quiet, not eerie quiet, just winter quiet, the kind where every sound carries farther than it should. About 15 minutes later, I reached the first cabin. Dark, same with the second. The third, exactly what I expected. No cars, no fresh tracks, just wind smoothing the snow across the lake. By the time I reached the 4th cabin, the first flakes had started falling. Soft ones, barely visible in the fading daylight. I stepped out of the truck, checked the propane tank, brushed some snow away from the doorframe, and scribbled a note on my clipboard. Routine. Then I got back in the truck and continued down the trail toward the last cabin. Cabin 5 sat the farthest out, almost half a mile past the others, tucked deeper into the trees where the shoreline curved. Most guests preferred the first few cabins because they were closer to the road. Cabin 5 rarely got booked in winter, which is why the lights caught my attention immediately. Warm yellow light glowed through the windows. At first, I assumed the owner had rented it out without telling me. That happens sometimes. But as I got closer, something felt slightly off. There were no vehicle tracks, no snowmobile trails. The snow along the driveway was untouched, fresh, smooth. I slowed the truck and pulled up near the porch. The lights inside were definitely on. Kitchen, living room, even the small lamp near the window. But the snow leading to the door looked completely undisturbed. I sat there for a moment, engine idling, trying to make sense of it. Maybe someone had arrived before the snow started. Maybe the wind had drifted snow across their tracks. Still, if someone was staying there, the chimney should have been smoking. It wasn't. No smoke, no movement inside. Just steady yellow light. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the truck. The air had that dry bite that comes right before heavier snow begins. The porch steps creaked softly under my boots as I walked up. Still no footprints. None, not even partial ones under the light snowfall. That detail stuck with me. I knocked once on the door. Hello? No answer. Just the faint hum of electricity inside. I tried the handle, locked. I walked around the side of the cabin, shining the flashlight through the windows. Furniture exactly where it always was. Table, chairs, blankets folded on the couch. Everything normal, except no one was inside. But the lights were definitely on. That's when I noticed something else. The power line. Each cabin had its own overhead line running from a small transformer pole nearby. The line to cabin 5 sagged slightly under the accumulating snow, but the breaker box mounted on the outside wall was switched off. I stared at it for a moment. Then I looked back toward the glowing windows. It didn't make sense. With the breaker off, the cabin shouldn't have had power. At all. I flipped the breaker once, down, then back up. Inside, the lights flickered briefly, then steadied, which meant they'd already been running. I remember standing there for a long moment, trying to convince myself there was a simple explanation. Maybe another breaker inside. Maybe wiring I didn't know about. But that didn't explain the tracks, or the lack of them. The snow was falling heavier now, thick flakes drifting down through the porch light. I decided the smartest thing to do was just head back to town and let the owner know. Before leaving, I looked once more across the smooth snow around the cabin. Still untouched, still blank. I climbed back into the truck, turned around carefully on the narrow trail, and began the slow drive back toward the road. About 5 minutes later, as the trees thinned slightly along the lake edge, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Through the falling snow, I could still see cabin 5 in the distance, a small square of warm yellow light in the woods. Then something changed. One of the lights went dark, then another, then the last one. The cabin went completely black. I slowed the truck instinctively, watching, waiting, but nothing else happened. Just snow falling across the empty trail. I kept driving. The storm hit harder that night. By morning, nearly a foot of snow had fallen. Later that afternoon, I drove back out with the owner to check on the cabins again. When we reached cabin 5, the snow around it was untouched. No tracks, no footprints, no vehicle marks, nothing. Inside, everything was exactly as it should have been. Lights off, breaker on, no signs anyone had been there. The owner asked me why I'd turned the lights on. I told him I hadn't, and I'm not sure he believed me. But the thing that still sticks with me is that moment in the mirror, watching those lights go out, one by one, like someone inside the cabin was moving from room to room. If these stories reminded you how dangerous isolation can be during a storm, make sure you hit like, subscribe, and let me know which encounter unsettled you the most. But blizzards aren't the only situations where people discover something wrong too late. Click now to watch 4 disturbing police horror stories, because sometimes the people responding to a call walk into something they weren't expecting either. Thanks for watching. Stay alert, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.